Boardroom Bound, episode 45. What it means to be an effective director in the digital age with Dottie Schindlinger.
Why isn't digital technology the biggest topic on every board agenda? If you touch customers through your website, if you have a social media presence, and you use any digital technology to perform your business, you're a tech company.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we'll be speaking with Dottie Schindlinger. She is a Vice President of Thought Leadership for Diligent, which is the leading provider of secure corporate board communication and collaboration software globally. She is the co-author, along with the CEO of the company, Brian Stafford, of Governance in the Digital Age, a guide for the modern corporate board director. And she's also co-host of a very similar podcast to this called the Corporate Director Podcast, basically trying to do the same thing we are in sharing the right best practices, the information people need at their fingertips. We've both realized that this information wasn't out there. Thrilled for you to meet Dottie and hear the great work that she is doing and her fantastic insights to governance and the way that their book and the podcast are sharing information that I know will help you on your journey. Let's jump into the show. Dottie Schindlinger, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Alexander. Thanks so much for the invitation to join you.
Well, we were joking before we got on the show that we just had to get together and talk because we are fellow podcasters in this same space talking about the boardroom and governance, and your show is the Corporate Director Podcast, and we were laughing because both of us are governance geeks and we love this stuff.
Totally.
And we thought this is a great space to play in. And when we did the research, it's really an uncovered space, which is fascinating because you're 700,000 podcasts. But talk us through it a little bit more from, clearly we want to know more of your background, but how you ended up thinking like this would be a great way to go through and share this knowledge.
Yeah, it's such a great point, and I bet you had the exact same experience that I did, but maybe just kind of stepping back for just a second. So I work for a company called Diligent Corporation, which is basically a software provider in the board space. So we really kind of do what we think of as modern governance, which is a combination of providing the right technology tools and then helping people understand the right processes that they need to put in place in the boardroom to really leverage those tools to advance governance. And so we wrote a book just in the past year called Governance in the Digital Age, and we wanted to create a podcast that would help keep that book current, because of course anything you write about technology, and in this case the focus of the book is much more on governance than technology. We wanted to understand, it's called a guide for the modern corporate board director. We wanted to have something that would help directors really understand the way that they can keep up when your entire business model could shift based on a tweet that morning.
Right.
So we wanted to write something about those issues. But like any book that has anything to do with technology, almost the minute that you turn the manuscript into the publisher, it's outdated. So we were really thinking, we got to do something to try to keep these issues current and keep it meaningful and relevant to corporate directors. So we decided we'd start a podcast. And, we wanted to at first just make sure we got people on the podcast that had contributed in some way to the book and get their voices heard. But as we started to look around to see what podcasts were already out there on corporate governance issues, we were pretty surprised how few there were. In fact, I got really excited one day. I saw this podcast called Chairman of the Board, and I thought, oh, great. Here's a podcast for corporate board chairmen. And when I looked into it a little further, I found out, in actual fact, it's a podcast about board games.
And you'd be amazed the number of podcasts about board games. It's huge.
It's so true. I had no idea that board games had this incredible podcast subculture, but they do. And then there were, I think you even mentioned to me, there's a number of podcasts about surfboards. So it's really funny. I mean, of course, there's a podcast about everything these days. But what was sort of surprising is you would expect a topic as hot and as relevant to so many people as good corporate governance would have so few podcasts. And so we decided to start what we call the Corporate Director Podcast. It comes out every other week. And again, its original purpose was to try to provide a platform to keep the issues of the book current. But I think now we're really expanding beyond that. We have the first, 10 shows are in production, 4 have been released. The next one will come out in just a few days here. Comes out every other week. And then we've got the next set of podcasts already sort of thought through. And what we're trying to do with that podcast is 2 things. One is we want to provide a platform that is a voice for modern governance, and in particular a voice for corporate directors. Really get them talking about things that they are dealing with, and not in a way where they feel like it's a gotcha kind of program. Mm-hmm. I think there's just a lot of stuff out there where people try to get corporate directors to talk about what's going wrong, or some scandal that they're involved in or something like that. And we didn't want to do anything like that. Instead, we thought, there's not enough of a balance of what's going right. Can you tell us a story of something you're really proud of?
Right.
What did you do that actually had a positive impact that maybe someone at another company might want to copy as opposed to what they should avoid? And so that's really the focus of the podcast. The second focus would be to be global. So we're a global company. About 55% of our 16,000 customers are outside the U.S. We work with about 650,000 directors and senior leaders around the world. And a good half, or a little more than half of them, are outside the U.S. So we want to make sure that the focus of the show is truly global. And we try to do that by presenting issues that have reach across different geographies, but also by bringing directors from all over the world onto the show to find out what's happening in Australia or in Singapore or in Hong Kong or in the UK or Germany. Really kind of trying to give that lens of what does corporate governance look like in these different places, and what's the same and what's different.
And I think that's a beautiful point, because there are key organizations across the world, Canada, UK, Australia, others that
Right.
are focused on this topic. And there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences based on corporate law and things like that. So I've been surprised in a very happy way to find out we've become very popular down in Australia, because I've had a couple Australians on, and they are huge in corporate governance and people getting on boards. And it's so funny you talk about that. The other part I love that you talk about is having conversations out in the open. So one of our previous guests was Doug Cha, who ran the Governance Center for the Conference Board on episode 18. And he talked about how they have these events where it's a closed-door session, sort of Chatham House rules, and people have conversations that are perhaps in different industries, but they're facing similar challenges on the board, and they can talk through best practices, what happened, because they don't feel they can do that in public without getting ridiculed, or you're worried about an activist investor or something like that. So they do it behind closed doors. So I love that you're allowing those learnings to happen.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you put yourself in the role, for example, of a general counsel or a company secretary, if you hear that your directors are going to be interviewed anywhere, it right away kind of raises a red flag of, oh my gosh, what does the reporter want to hear from them? What's the angle, right? Like, what are they trying to get at? And I think what's been really great about what we're doing with the podcast, and even also what we did with the book, is we're not trying to do a gotcha. We're really trying to do the opposite of that. We think there's probably value to be gleaned from lots of different quarters, and we want the directors to be able to share those stories and to do it in a way where they can, be proud of the things that they should be proud of. I mean, every company, good, bad, and ugly, has wins. Has things that are good that we could all learn from. And especially if you're speaking, from directors to other directors, there are definitely things that they could potentially share of practices that are happening in their boardroom that have had a really positive impact. And even in situations where they've been through some trouble, we want to know how they're turning it around, right? We want to know what are they doing differently now to try to make sure that whatever that bad thing was doesn't happen again. And I just feel like there's not enough attention paid to the stuff we do right. And partly that's I think we all get much more excited about the stuff that goes wrong. I think it tends to be a little sexier, in terms of media coverage. But if we're doing something that's for directors, I feel like the opposite is true. I feel like what they really desperately want, and what they're telling us that they want, is tell me what to do about it. Tell me what I can do differently or better. I should never do that. Got it. But that leaves the whole world of other possibilities. What's the right strategy? So we wanted to try to provide a platform for those kinds of conversations.
I love that. And so we recently released an episode where Peter Gleason, who's the CEO of NACD, was talking about their annual summit down in DC. And this is massive. You will have thousands of directors there, and any conversation you want to learn about is there, which is wonderful. But it's great in between, say, the annual events to be able to tune into a podcast and hear those different sort of topicals and conversations. And, for all of us, there's a reason why we want to share. Some people are passionate for different reasons why they're doing board work. And I'd love to unpick that a bit about yourself, because you didn't get to become a governance geek overnight. This took a lot of hard work for you to get there. And you and I were joking before the show, and I'd love for you to share this a bit more of your first experience on a board wasn't a particularly positive one, right?
That's true. Yeah, so I came out of University of Pennsylvania back in we'll just go with early 90s because I don't really want to make it too much more specific, having just had a birthday yesterday. A little humbling. But at any rate, so I came out of college. I had a degree in English. I didn't really know what I was going to be when I grew up, what I was going to do with that. I didn't come from business school. I didn't, sort of have that experience, and sort of stumbled into a role as the executive assistant to the executive director of a small nonprofit, actually kind of a small foundation. And there was a statewide board for that organization. And one of my first jobs out of college was to organize those board meetings and to put together the materials for those board meetings and kind of facilitate everything around what happens with the board. And for anybody who's ever been in that governance professional role, you know that the moment you get one of those jobs, it's a crash course.
That's a lot of pressure, too.
Right. And so, I won't say the name of the organization because, I kind of got a bird's eye view of what can go wrong, more so than what can go right. And I really got hooked. I just immediately got hooked on the idea of governance and really started to kind of try to understand it and began to kind of follow that path. And eventually I worked for about 6 years at LaSalle University as part of their business school. They had a group called the Nonprofit Center, and the focus there was, providing kind of good business education and organizational development skills to nonprofits in the greater Philadelphia region. And one of the roles I had there was to get this program off the ground specifically for nonprofit board members. And again, I just really ate that up. I got so interested in the topics. I got so interested in the work that these board members were doing and in how they could do it better and on the impact that it could have on the organization. But one of the things that was always a little frustrating about it, to be honest, was, we would do these great one-day workshops and we would do consulting engagements and other things. And, sometimes if you went back to the organization 6 months or a year later, literally nothing had changed. Like no needles had moved. Like basically all the same issues that they had the year previously were all still there. And of course, it's partly because you're kind of running into this culture issue. Like one person coming to a workshop doesn't change a culture necessarily. But also, I think it was because there wasn't a lot of opportunity to really operationalize the best practices, right? I mean, you would go to a workshop or you'd have a consulting engagement, you'd learn all these great practices, but then how do you actually put them into effect? Like, what are the systems and the processes behind getting that to actually function? And it was right around that time that a friend of mine, a woman by the name of Leanne Berge, had this small website development company in the Philadelphia region, and she was just toying with the idea of creating some type of a SaaS product for nonprofit boards. That became known as Board Effect, and I jumped on very early. I thought that was a brilliant idea. I said, I really want to go play in that sandbox. The idea of building software that was dedicated to helping boards operationalize best practices in governance just got me really excited. So I worked with Board Effect for its entirety. I started basically the first year that it was kind of founded, and we then got acquired at the end of 2016 by Diligent Corporation, which was maybe the best day of my life, honestly, because Diligent is really kind of the unparalleled leader in this space and by far the biggest player in the space. I mean, I think about 10 times bigger than the next biggest player. And so I went from being part of a 38-person team serving about 1,500 organizations to being part of a 1,000-person team with 12 global offices serving 16,000 customers and 650,000 corporate directors. And so now I'm doing very similar stuff, but on a much bigger stage, and it's just phenomenal. It's so much fun. It's really exciting to see so many corporate directors taking that role so incredibly seriously, and I think you'll hear that on the podcast, you'll read that in the book, the strategies that they are using, how they are truly students of their businesses, the stuff that they are trying is fascinating. And we still have yet to see kind of what are the winning strategies, so to speak. Like, we still kind of have to do that research and figure out really what will work and in what way. But it's really cool to watch this all happening in real time and to be a part of it.
Well, I can hear your passion for it. And the bigger stage, I think, is very true. We're also joking you're in the midst of your world tour for the book. Clearly,
That's
lots
true.
of information to share. And, give us a little bit of a teaser about the book, right? So we will have a link to it in the show, of course. But you have this opportunity to help educate people. And you joked in the beginning, right? It's already out of date, which is why we're doing the podcast. But what were we trying to get across there? Because some people are thinking technology in a board pack. And we're thinking the old sort of board pack, which was 1,000 pages. You can imagine the thud that landed on your table. I won't name names, but one of my friends used to run for one of the biggest mutual fund companies all of their board work. And she talked about the evolution of that over time, what you used to have to mail and how it was out of date because you didn't mail it so early. It's very different now. You've got a technology portal and a platform. So help us understand that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating, right? I think what's happening with the technology around boardrooms is very interesting. But what we wanted to try to do with the book wasn't so much that. That's what we do for a living, right? We have a software platform that we provide to boards of all sizes, of all industries, of all kinds, all around the world. So we kind of know that world. What we were interested to do was to ask a different question, which is, when it comes to technology, there really is no part of our businesses that it hasn't dramatically transformed, right? I mean, if you think about it, you could reasonably make the argument that it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you're a technology company now. If you touch customers through your website, if you have a social media presence, if you do anything with e-commerce, if you do anything with your operations that requires any type of digital communication, and you use any digital technology to perform your business, you're a tech company in some regard. And so what's fascinating to me is, why isn't digital technology the biggest topic on every board agenda? And that's been a question I've had for probably about 10 years. And so we had this opportunity to think about writing a book. And I was like, I know exactly what I want to write it about. I want to find out what is really changing about board practices in this era of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity being driven first and foremost by digital disruption and by the speed of information. I mean, you think about like a movement like the hashtag Me Too movement, and regardless of any other aspect of that movement you might think of what that's doing in corporate boardrooms. Like, they've
scaring
gone
a
from
lot of
having
people
a
is partly
situation
what
where
it's doing.
Totally. I mean, think about it though. Like, we used to have an era where there might be a complaint lodged to, a part of the HR team about an executive in the company, right? And eventually that report might bubble up to the board.
Right.
And then the board could kind of come up with a strategy. And then they could coordinate that with the PR team and the HR team and the legal team. And they could then enact whatever that plan was. Well, something like hashtag Me Too has completely flipped that on its head, because now the board is scrambling to keep up with information that is already public before they even find it out.
Right.
So they have no idea something's about to happen. It happens on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, and voila, they now have to react. And quite frankly, their shareholders and their stakeholders expect them to do it perfectly and fast. And so I don't know about you, but I don't know very many boards that are ready to do that well.
Well, and the related point to that as well is also on risk management. For many, and it varied by industry, right? But some industries were not very good about keeping risk as important and topical of mind and front and center. But those risks very quickly become issues now that you have to address.
Exactly.
Are you doing that efficiently and effectively? So these things tie in together.
That's right. And so I feel like boards now are really getting graded, not so much on whether or not they have experienced something, but more so on how did they react and respond, and did they do it quickly enough and thoroughly enough and thoughtfully enough. And so for the book, we said, let's figure out what is actually changing about boardroom practices because of these pressures. So we didn't really dive into any specific technology. We wanted to understand all the pressure that's getting created because of technology, because of the speed of information, because of the way that our world is being disrupted through digital technology. How are boards keeping up? Are they keeping up? And what could they be doing differently to help them keep up? So that's really what the thrust of the book is all about. And then we went out and we did a ton of research, but we also interviewed directors from all over the world that we felt were doing things that we thought were particularly innovative and interesting. And they vary in age, they vary from industry, they vary in how many boards they serve on, but they all have these really compelling stories to share about stuff that is changing in their boardrooms and what they think the outcome is likely to be.
And it's fascinating because of what's playing out in the public, because there is a lot more awareness and scrutiny about boards and are they doing well. And, we've seen the recent scandals, Uber, CBS, the list goes on and on.
Right.
And what we're finding now is boards are starting to react, and it's for lots of reasons. So we don't have enough females. We don't have enough minorities. We could say diversity of thought in general, but it's also like we haven't had turnover in our board in a decade. Is that a good idea? So you're starting to see different perspectives. Should we expand the size of the board? Should we force some people to roll off? And it's fascinating also watching by different industries. There are some people now that are jumping directly into a corporate boardroom who haven't had board experience before because they have a skill set that people didn't know, whether it's, say, cyber risk or I'm a social media marketing expert and I can come in and share that. So it's wonderful that you guys are touching upon that, because I think, especially perhaps if you've been a long-serving director and you're used to doing it a certain way, the need to change and that pace of change might be really hard to adapt to.
Yep, exactly. And so my co-author and I Brian Stafford, who's our CEO, he and I co-authored the book together. And that was a really great collaborative process, too, because Brian has a very different line of sight to a lot of our customers than I do, for example, from the thought leadership perspective. So we kind of came together and made this book. But one of the things that we observed, especially through all the interviews that we conducted and the research that we did, was that we saw sort of different ways that boards were trying to deal with these issues. And we decided to create what we call the board behavioral profiles. There's sort of 4 profiles. And these, by the way, these are not set in stone. These are not like, Myers-Briggs archetypes or anything like that. But we saw sort of 4 different ways that boards could approach the same issues and do it differently. And we sort of observed that when a board is in a different moment of time, they might switch their profile, right? So we saw, for example, what we called foundational boards, which were really very focused on growth, almost to the exclusion of anything else. And that meant that they didn't really have a ton of very formal board processes. They might not have a lot of committees. They might be a bit smaller, versus something that we called the structural board, which is very much about compliance and oversight. And they have much more robust committees and much stronger processes, much more formalized. And that differed pretty dramatically from what we observed and we called a catalyst board, which is the board that, they sort of see their role as turnaround or transformation. And so they become very hungry for data. They get very deep in the weeds about what's happening with the company, even sometimes doing their own due diligence outside of what they're getting from inside management, right? So that's a very different approach. And then finally, we saw a smaller subset that we called the futuristic board, which is really sort of focused on legacy. They're the ones that are sort of thinking about, okay, all this stuff is happening over here, but how are we going to make sure the company is still around 10 years from now? Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at the research on that, I think back in the 1960s, something like, 30% of companies on the S&P 500 would be around in the next 10 years. Now that percentage has dropped to something like 12%.
Right.
So you can count on only 12% of companies on the S&P 500 to still be in business a decade from now. So, those boards that are really thinking about legacy, they have a lot to think about. And they're sort of focused in a very different way from like a growth board or from a catalyst board even. So we started to see these different behavioral profiles playing out, and we tried to the extent we possibly could share some of the specific stories from each one of those lenses so that you get a sense of, how 2 boards approaching the same issue might approach it very differently and what the outcomes might look like depending on which profile they decide to adopt.
I love that. I think that's a great way to share the stories, because stories are what resonate with people. That's what we remember. And
exactly.
I can't help this in my management consulting mindset from earlier in my career. I just look at this. I can see the life cycle mapping out of a company and them changing in these over time. And it's just it's a beautiful thing to think about someone who joins a board perhaps at the end of their foundational period when the growth is happening really quickly and they stabilize. And now suddenly they're more of a structural board, but eventually something goes wrong and they're a catalyst. And maybe the last year in their career before they retire from this company after a decade or two, maybe they're in a catalyst stage at this point. So it's fascinating.
Well, yeah, and it's really true, but, it's so interesting because, and this is, I think, very indicative of this time of volatility that we're all living in and have been living in for at least a decade now and doesn't show any signs of getting more calm anytime soon. I think that model of sort of there's a life cycle that organizations follow was probably true before digital disruption and might be less so now, because what we were hearing from boards was that they might be a structural board and switch tomorrow to being a foundational board because they realize that for the next 18 months they have to focus on nothing but growth, and they need to get rid of all these committees and shortcut a lot of these processes. Or they might be a foundational board that suddenly has a major crisis and suddenly leapfrogs right over to being a catalyst board. And in catalyst mode, they're not thinking so much about oversight. They're thinking much more about creation of value and how do we make sure that we are creating long-term value as we weather this storm. So it was very interesting to see how boards really flip and flop around, and they're not necessarily in one particular stage. You know what I mean? And that's why we called them behavioral profiles rather than stages, because it just didn't seem to follow any sort of a linear map. And maybe that's something to be challenged now. I mean, we are in this time of kind of unprecedented uncertainty, and maybe it's time to kind of go back and look at some of those old models to see, were they only true insofar as we knew what technology was going to move our planet? And now that we simply cannot predict with any level of certainty what next app is going to completely remake our market, maybe those old models don't hold up as well. Who knows? So it's sort of interesting to watch it all happen in real time and try to measure it. That's always very fun.
I love that. And I also am thinking about, like, imagining our audience here, someone who is a new director and perhaps is stepping into it and thinking, oh my gosh, what did I get into? Or someone who's preparing to do it a year from now. And I would encourage people to take two perspectives of probably know where your skill set is. So imagine you are a deep analytical type who loves numbers and can crunch it. So clearly, based on the way that you described it, Catalyst is a magical fit where you come in and you're going to help them plow through it. How would you be able to interact and add value in perhaps some of the other ones, maybe more of a strategy space where that's not yours, but also thinking about the people that you're interviewing with to be on a board, knowing which one are they in now? So what sort of questions would you be asking? How would they ask? And probably recognizing all of the people you're interviewing also similarly, because they're humans, have skill sets in certain areas. So are there places where they're struggling or they're succeeding between different places in time? Do you feel that coming out on some of the stories that you're sharing on your show?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really fascinating, right? Because one of the things we started to hear that, frankly, made me very encouraged, we heard this over and over again from directors about how they are now sort of reconsidering how they view things like board composition and even board diversity as more of an issue of competitive advantage than of fairness. Meaning they now recognize that in order for them not to miss the next big trend, they've got to have the voices at the table that bring the different perspectives to challenge the status quo. And that's a very different talk track than even 3 years ago or 5 years ago. I think 3 and 5 years ago, it was much more about, what do we see as sort of universal best practices that others are doing? And, can we in fact measure the financial impact of, board diversity programs and other things? And now I think directors are saying, yeah, that's all well and good, but in the meantime, we need to make sure we have a couple technologists on this board so that we don't miss out on, blockchain, for example. Like, what do we do about blockchain, and is that something that we need to apply to our business? Or what do we do about artificial intelligence and algorithms? Are we leveraging those in a way that will drive our business? I mean, they're asking those kinds of questions now. And when that happens, I think they're starting to say, if we look around the boardroom and we all kind of look the same and we all kind of think the same, we might be in really hot water. We might have a lot of risk.
Yeah,
and we might be carrying way too much risk.
The easy way to picture that, right? If a board looks pale, male, and stale, right? There can't be a lot of innovation going on because we're all thinking in the same way. And you could paint that in a lot of different pictures. Like if we're all the same of some bet, it could be we're all from the same industry, right? You're not going to get the innovative thought because you need people who've gone through different experiences, like you've talked about, not only being different industries, but have you seen this problem before? So we've had Cheryl Batchelder on the show, and twice she has been on the board of a company, and they have then needed to pull her in to be the CEO of the company, right?
Yeah.
So you can't imagine what's going to happen between one day and another in a business. You got to be ready to add value in different ways.
And right, exactly. And then you have to sort of think about it from the 30,000-foot level of, okay, do we even have the expertise available to us? And maybe it's not always about board composition. I mean, I think that's part of the mixture, but it's also about board education, right? So are we bringing on people that have the perspectives we lack? But then are we also making sure that we're educating the whole board to make sure that we can, with some level of competence, discuss the issues that we don't yet know anything about, right? Are we taking the board outside the boardroom and getting them in front of, the R&D group of a related industry that might impact our business decisions, right? So it's sort of all these different tactics and approaches that are happening at the board level. And honestly, I feel like this might be the first time, at least I've ever seen a book that tries to measure some of this stuff and tries to understand it both from the perspective of directors, but also from the larger picture of what's happening with governance writ large. And hey, it's a first effort. I think what we need to do is probably consider a follow-up to this. Hopefully the podcast will help in continuing this discussion and continuing the narrative. There's a lot more work to be done. I just feel like we haven't asked these questions enough. And I feel like it's really strange that we haven't asked these questions enough. I mean, it's always made me scratch my head. Like, we are so interested to know how digital disruption is playing out all over our businesses, except in the boardroom? Really? Like, they're only the leaders of the company. Why would we care about it there? It's just so strange. It just makes no sense to me. So I'm hoping that, we've started a conversation people will want to continue.
Well, let's be clear. The boardroom is often packed with brilliant business minds, but we often treat it differently. So imagine in most, let's say, for-profit company, we will have performance reviews for our employees. But how many times in a boardroom do you hear us are we doing performance reviews on the board directors? And oftentimes they'd be like, no, and I don't have goals that I need to set. Actually, we all should have that. That's a good best practice.
That's a whole other podcast episode about board evaluation. Yeah, we could riff on that one for at least an hour. Yeah.
Well, to that point, I mean, this time has just flown by. We're going to have to save the comments. We'll have to come back and do it again. But I'm encouraged that you've started up another podcast in this space. I know it will be great for our audience because you're talking through more examples, more learning points, which at the end of the day is what we all need. So it's wonderful to be able to have, just like we're talking about, technology that's changing things. You can pull it up and at your convenience while you're washing dishes or cutting the lawn or on a plane, on a flight, whatever you're doing. You have the opportunity to hear more of this. So we will have links in the show notes to both the podcast, but also the book. And I'm a big believer that leaders are readers. And we want to be able to grab the information, understand it, and especially for board directors, whether you're sitting or aspiring, technology is changing things. It will continue to change things in a way we can't even imagine yet. So getting our mind wrapped around that and keeping it open to the possibilities is essential. So Dottie, we are so pleased that you were able to share that with us today. And I'm sure there will be people that will want to be in touch, not only with what we talked about, the podcast, and get a copy of the book, but perhaps follow some of your great tweets. I think your best one today was a time of unprecedented uncertainty, right? There's a tweet right there. How should people stay in touch and be connected to what you guys have going on?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And by the way, thank you for having me on the Boardroom Bound podcast. This has been so much fun, and I feel the same way you do. I'm so delighted, Alexander, that you are in this space and that we're having this conversation together. So there's so much more work to be done. I'm glad we're not each of us doing it solo. Right. So that's great. So how to reach out to us? The best way would be several things. You can go to diligent.com/podcast to learn more about the Corporate Director Podcast. If you go to diligent.com/governance in the digital age, you'll find information about the book. You can also reach out to us on Twitter at DirectorPod or at GovTechGeek. That'll get directly to me. So if you go to Perfect. at GovTechGeek, either on Twitter or LinkedIn, you'll find me at DirectorPod. You'll get to the podcast, and diligent.com. You can get to our company and find all kinds of useful stuff.
Well, Dottie, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be more boardroom bound.
Thank you so much, Alexander. It's been such a pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Dottie Schindlinger. It was fabulous hearing all about her podcast, the Corporate Director Podcast, and also the book that she's written about the modern governance age and what you should be doing in adapting to technology and bring that to work for you. Great analogies they shared about where different life cycles are of a board and how they're adapting to different situations so quickly and dealing with the pressure today. And I love the stories that she is seeing and sharing and using through their podcast platform, because that will be great for a lot of our audience to be able to pick up from as well. And we talked a lot of the resources to share today, and you can find all of those at podcast.gordon.edu. Now, the Boardroom Bound team and I are proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.